be talking with Danny Haiphong later. First, I just want to bring everyone up to date. We had a great victory stopping Biden from appointing Michelle Flournoy to Department of Defense. That was effective and good, and I thank everybody for your engagement. And just thank everyone for engaging with Kamala Harris. We were able to see that Biden, lied again about China, but the press even noted that she stayed silent on the issue. So let's keep telling Kamala to pull the Biden team back, that what they're doing is escalating racism. So you can keep engaging with that at codepink.org/Kamala, and I'll put that in the chat. And then taking on Senator Marsha Blackburn, who her racist tweet with educating her about China. You can also engage in that one. We'll put that in the chat also. So yes, it continues, the lies of the media and still in the Biden administration, but the fact that, Michelle Flournoy, who was so ready to destroy the entire Chinese fleet in 72 hours, is not our immediate problem. So super thanks for all that. I want to introduce you to Danny Haiphong. He is the contributing editor to Black Agenda Report. He's the co-host of The Left Lens, an organizer with the global movement, No Cold War, and Black Alliance for Peace Support Network. He's the co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. You must get that. So welcome, Danny. So lovely to have you with us, and thanks for all the work you've been doing to raise up all the potholes and all the dark sides of this China's not our enemy backlash, etc. That's trying to stop the Cold War, which I think is already raging as far as a hybrid war is going. So one of the things I really want to talk about with you today is that as we're doing this work, we see all the kind of mud that gets thrown back in our faces, distorted conversations about different issues. And we really see at Code Pink, our job is to change the narrative, because those are State Department narratives and they become quagmires. So, staying out of their narratives, one of the really important ones that we feel we need to work on hard at Code Pink is the one about the racism that these hate and lies drive. And not only what that does, but what's been happening this year around that issue, and how far back does this go? Is that a lot in one question?
Well, thank you for having me, Jodie, and thanks to all the work that you all do at Code Pink. It's been incredible because, as you know, there is a shortage right now of people in the United States and the West where a lot of this anti-China sentiment is being driven. There's a shortage of people willing to stand up against it, willing to stand up against a new Cold War. The big narrative with the anti-China sentiment is, hold on one second. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so basically racism is really a shaping force in how the corporate media in the United States and the West is able to drum up support for this new Cold War that the United States is leading and is pulling all of its allies in the West and India and etc. to engage in. And really, the way that we need to approach this first is that China and its government need to be seen as what it is human beings, right? I mean, we have to start there, because I think that a lot of the a willingness to believe whatever the United States and its media and its allies say about China is this idea that China is in fact inferior to the United States' way of life and the Western way of life. Uh, but I think if COVID-19 has shown us anything, it's that actually the world is moving in a different direction from the United States with China in the lead, and that people in the United States and the West have a lot of problems that they need to address. And COVID-19 being basically a pandemic that has yet to be contained after nearly a year dealing with this problem, while China is on the right side of this and is now projecting 8% growth next year in GDP terms, has contained the virus. So death is basically non-existent and cases are very, very minimal. That's a huge achievement in global terms. And we're missing so many opportunities when there isn't this capacity to view China and its people and its government as what they are, which is comprised of human beings who are organizing themselves for their purposes, for their needs. And if it's different from how the United States does it, then we need to be able to be curious rather than inherently falling into and automatically falling into what is really a centuries long problem, an over a century long problem. This Cold War mentality, this anti-communist mentality, this racist mentality, and it dates back to even before the advent of the Cold War, when the US and the UK and the Western powers looked at China as an opportunity for colonial investment, for domination. And now that China is coming out of that century of humiliation from 1849 to 1949, from 1949 until now, building its own trajectory, now that it has the ability to compete and has the ability to meet needs not only for itself, but for nations around the world, the United States is beginning to change its attitude towards China from one of a cautious potential partner to now an enemy. And that's really troubling. And it's really up to people here in this country and in the Western world to be able to look at exactly why that is. Why is it that China is looked at so inhumanely? Is it exactly because of how um, China is portrayed in the media? Is that really what China is like? And that curiosity hopefully will stem more resistance to new Cold War policies that the United States is waging, because really there's no interest in it for working people unless they're convinced that there is interest in this new Cold War for them. So yeah, I think
Don't
it's
you think
really
that,
basically against.
sorry, don't you think
No,
that
that's okay.
um, people, you know, as an anti-war activist, I find it hard for people to engage in war because it's such an abstract notion. And all wars have been driven by lies and hate and dehumanizing. That's been used against everyone. But, here you've got, you actually can say to people, these lies and hate, they're actually hurting people right now in the United States. It's not about over there. It's everyone has, people, Asian Americans in their lives. And it's not like you have to be looking over there. This behavior is happening at home and causing real problems. Um, I mean, I live in LA, so I can say that Asian racism has been going on for a really, really long time. And, they don't even talk about, so long. But the problem is nobody's ever talked about it. Nobody's, few even remember or talk about how horribly Asian Americans have been treated throughout the history of the United States. But as a way to talk about this war against China, it's home. It's not even like you have to go over there. How do you experience that?
Yeah, well, it was a shaping force in my life. I mean, yellow peril has existed for more than a century in the United States, for more than a century and a half. I mean, the connection between the opium wars and the mass migration that came from that as people fled there to the United States in order to build the railroads, in order to work in this country. And then the way that they were treated worse than second class. They were treated as non-humans, and the policies of exclusion and the violence. I mean, a lot of people talk about exclusion and the Chinese Exclusion Act, but that was followed by literal state violence and vigilante violence, which was really mimicked and produced from what the United States has really practiced since its inception against Black people and Indigenous people. So that ideological basis and that material foundation for this global yellow peril that the United States is spreading around the world about China really is rooted in how the United States has always approached the world and has always approached people that it sees as ripe for exploitation. And this racism is all about justifying that. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing this real shift in the United States toward a negative view of China, but that just doesn't mean, oh, people have a negative view of the country that's thousands of miles away. It's that they have a negative view of the people that signify what China represents. This Red Scare, this yellow peril, both of those things combined means that the human beings, the people that both live here in the United States and live in China, are targets of warfare, and ideological warfare, as well as the political and military and economic measures. We just had this in the last few weeks. The United States has basically blacklisted the Communist Party of China, a party of 90 plus million people and its family members, saying that now their visas are only worth, I think it's 10 days, right? They're basically no one who has any affiliation, quote unquote, with the Communist Party of China can stay in this country and can really do any kind of business. And that is one of the most egregious measures that we've seen that targets the leadership of the most populous, fastest growing country in the world that really humanity needs to collaborate with, right? They are part of the global family. They're part of the human family. And without real collaboration and solidarity, all of the problems, war, poverty, climate change, they're unable to be resolved in any kind of significant way. It really is in the worst interests of people in the United States and West to be engaging in this behavior. But there are benefits for those who see China as a real quote unquote threat to their economic and political domination and prosperity. And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with really a tiny few people and a tiny few corporations, a tiny few governments who are trying to mold a hegemonic narrative about China that will serve their own ends, which really means more war and more of the things that we really need to get out of if we're going to survive as a species.
Well, you really nailed it on that hegemony, please, because I think, here is the US behaving out of their hegemony by, arresting the chief financial officer of Huawei. It's like, how do you get away with that? No one in the world would allow that to happen. That's like with no grounds, absolutely no grounds, just like because they decided and they're going to make up a lie and that's ridiculous. What happened with TikTok and WeChat? That is against every law. Like you just get to pillage. I mean, it's really interesting. Instead of pillaging resources, you're pillaging a tech company. It's still pillaging. So the US is behaving in its usual rape and pillage way. And there's no one to stop it. Everyone's in agreement about it. But when you look before a war at the behavior, here's this horrible behavior of attacks on China that are illegal, immoral, unconstitutional, against international law. And they just keep happening without anybody screaming because, oh my God, because it's communist and it's like you can't, be for communism instead of like No, it's another country with another set of values, trying to run, I mean, doing a really good job at taking care of 1.5 billion people. And here's the US, can't even take care of 350 million people. And it's, you know, it's just ridiculous. So, you know, here we are in the middle of absurdity, basically. Because as you said, they're taking care of their people much better and solving problems that we should be cooperating with them on. And they have been vocal in their desire to be in cooperation. They have no desire to be at war. And so, you know, how do we as activists stand in the face of that? And, you know, what are things we can do?
Yeah, well, there is so much war propaganda, so much racist vitriol targeted at China. I think the first uh, job of anyone wanting to fight for peace is to begin to learn more about what are the roots of this new Cold War. Why is the United States so belligerent, so hostile? Uh, you mentioned Meng Wanzhou of Huawei and how she remains in house arrest in Canada at the basically enforced by the United States. And she's accused of violating Iranian sanctions, right? Huawei, that's what they're accused of. And that's why she remains under house arrest. But there are connections to this. And it's important that if you're a peace activist and you're against sanctions in Iran, you're against sanctions in Venezuela, you're against the US occupation of Syria, that you're also against the new Cold War on China, because they are not separated at all. If you look at, for example, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that was passed last year, in it, it's not a very long summary of the bill. I've never read the whole thing, but if you read the summary, one of the first few points is that Hong Kong is subject to sanctions, ironically, if it is used, supposedly by China, to violate sanctions on the DPRK and on Iran. So that's a nifty little clause that was just slipped into that bill in order to not just punish China, not just punish Hong Kong, but to punish Iran and to punish the DPRK. The new Cold War on China is a global policy. It's about a vision of the world that the United States has, which is the United States is on top. It is the hegemon, and it will dominate as it see fits, and it will not allow any country to survive and live in a way that is different from its own priorities of never-ending profits for the few and very little, if not anything, for the many. So
But when did China
I think
agree to
that's a
that?
big
It's
part
like,
of this.
how do you get to put someone in jail for something you didn't agree to? Like that's, you're not under US law.
Exactly.
So,
It's a total,
so
and it's not international. Sanctions are not international law either. They're a violation of international law if they're, if anything, an act of war. So exactly, China didn't agree to that. China did not do anything wrong. Huawei is a huge tech company with leading the world in global patents for the last 3 years. That's why Huawei is under attack, is because it is actually leading in 5G technology and all sorts of telecommunications and other avenues of high tech. And it cannot be allowed to do that. So the United States is doing anything it can through sanctions, through this kind of diplomatic warfare, in order to curb China's growth in that way. And yes, it is a violation, and it has real implications. I mean, when we think about China is one of the few countries, now it's an economic power, and it's one of the few countries in the world that is capable of providing resources to other countries and is willing to not kowtow to US sanctions. So it does trade with everybody, including Venezuela, including Iran, including the DPRK, including the other 20 plus countries that the US has starvation sanctions against. And that's because China's government doesn't see US sanctions as a legitimate form of diplomacy or international relations. And that's exactly right. So these are things that I think the peace movement has to be aware of, that we have to look at what is what is the real catastrophe in the world right now? What did Martin Luther King say more than 50 years ago now? He said that the US is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Has that changed? No, that has become even more so the case than any other point in history. And if China is being scapegoated and seen as this principal enemy of humanity, then obviously we have things really upside down, and we have to work our way back to understanding what the real problem is, and what is really preventing this global human family we have from addressing these issues. And if we look really hard, we can see that China is doing a lot. They were just at a UN summit talking about how they're going to become carbon neutral in 2060. They have all of their government agencies working on it right at this moment. While in the United States, we're talking about a $600 stimulus check for tens of millions of unemployed people, and nothing about climate change. So that is the difference, I think, in where the world is going, because China is part of this global movement, I think, to recenter humanity on what is important, not property profits for just a few people, not endless war and austerity and cuts and endless accumulation of wealth, but the ability for people to meet their needs. And which I think China is showing is, once people can have their needs met, then you have so much capacity to then move on to other areas scientifically and technologically, which can do really beautiful things, as we saw during the pandemic in China, to ensure human life is preserved and able to flourish.
Yeah, watching a hospital go up in a week, watching, having the capacity to show up to what are going to be so many problems as we've created this crazy modern world that we live in that has not really cared about human life in the way that the Chinese seem to be caring more about human life than those in the hegemony. There's some lessons that we should be learning instead. But so how do you work on reconciling the US demanding China be like them, like that, that, how do you reconcile that problem of like, which is just a level of arrogance and hubris and like narcissism, all those things. It's kind of sort of the look of a white male, but like how do we help also reconcile that? Because there's so many things in trying to stop this war, this US aggression on China, that it illuminates imperialism. It's like, it's a complex story in the sense of China's complex and we try to make it simple. But in the story of imperialism, it gets to really create that story so simply. If you can, it's just right there. You're watching it in play, and you're watching so many other things in play, but you still have the U.S. and especially the patriarchy and what I call the callousness of capitalism against the caring of social, the socialism capitalism story. So there's a lot of things, but how do you look at that equivalency that the U.S. tries to force?
Yeah, well, there's so many facets to the equivalency too. We just had a report that the BBC released on the question of Xinjiang, and we know that the last few years that's been a huge part of this new Cold War, to say that China is destroying Islam in China, that it's oppressing Uyghurs, etc. We had Adrian Zenz once again come out with a report that China is forcing Uyghurs to pick cotton, insinuating on Twitter that it is akin to almost like the legacy of the United States, where the United States forced Africans to pick cotton and enslave them and coerce them, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that kind of element, this idea that China is like this new colonizer, right? This new imperialist monster with not an ounce of humanity in any of its policies. I think Josh Rogan of the Washington Post said that there's a joke in Washington that if China says that it wants to deal with countries on a win-win basis, that means China wins twice. So there's this whole idea that China is in fact worse than the United States, right? So, and I think a lot of people have bought into this. And I think that's why there's this negative view, is that when the pandemic happened and the US media went 24/7 and staring at China and saying, wow, look at the authoritarianism, look at the dictatorship, look at what it's doing in Wuhan, look at the people dying, look at the overrun healthcare system, right? There was this hyper focus on China at that time to make it seem like the sick man of Asia, quote unquote, this racist trope of the yellow peril era, this colonial ideology. And it fuels what I write a lot about, American exceptionalism. It fuels this idea that even if the United States is in this decrepit moment of crisis, that its so-called quote unquote democratic character, its electoral character, it's the one person, one vote, all of this, that at least is intact, and that makes it superior to China. And that allows for the United States to get away with all of its crimes that it is committing amid this global health crisis and this global economic crisis. And China gets to be the real gets the ire of the entire Western world on it. So, you know, I think that's this where this equivalency is, and these false equivalencies are drawn. And it's important to then we have to dig deeper, because while we can say, yes, US aggression on China is incorrect and we need to oppose that, we run the risk of allowing the ideological basis of US aggression on China to fester and grow if we aren't able to counter the myths with reality, right? We can't ignore the fact that this whole idea that China is wiping away Islam in the country negate how actual people in China are experiencing things a lot differently. And it's not that difficult if we pierce through the media and try to tune it out for a bit to find out that the situation is a lot more complex, and that China has been building mosques after mosques, putting into place laws to protect ethnic minorities, and that this has been a decades and decades long process of figuring out what a multi-ethnic country, over 50 ethnic minority populations within the country, trying to figure out how as one country to unify the country and respect cultural autonomy and religious autonomy. That is something that China has been doing for the last 70 plus years. And it's something that prior to 1949 was an absolute, it was horrific, because you had colonial powers, imperial powers, you had domestic warlords, all of this that people don't understand. They don't understand the history of China before 1949 and what people there have been trying to do and build. And so some of it is just trying to build some common respect and some understanding of how the people of China, how its government has been trying to address these problems, and to start to have a more balanced view of what that means. And so it's important that we study some of this stuff. And I think here it's most important to just make sure that we're very clear about who the sources of these information are, right? If we're not going to trust the corporate media on anything else, why then are we trusting the corporate media on China, right? We don't trust the corporate media when it's talking about war in any other instance. We don't, or at least we're a lot less likely to do it ever since we were lied about in regards to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So why is it that China now can be painted in this way by the corporate media, and so many people are willing to embrace it?
That is
Even people,
That
yeah.
is such an excellent point. Even in like the coalitions that we're working with, you just keep catching everybody believing the narrative of the State Department, and just like hook, line, and sinker, that's the fabric that they even make decisions out of. So we have a couple of interesting questions I want to bring up. One is that Cheryl wants to know, like, she doesn't want to make the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so she sees China as an extremely authoritarian country. And that how do you value the US and China at the same time? And I think this goes to what you were trying to say. It's like, why cannot we respect each other? Why, because isn't it hegemony and hubris to think your way is right, especially when your way is destroying the world and people, and more people are coming, like, especially when your way is failing and you're failing in every measure across the globe. So, why can't both exist? Why do we be threatened by someone who is different than us? So I think it really touches the racism piece we started with, is that we've been conditioned to believe that they're a horrible country. And here we are with, Cheryl reflecting it back to us, instead of like, what's horrible about taking 900 billion people out of poverty and investing in education so that your technological advantage on the globe is huge, because instead of building weapons, you've been educating scientists. So, how do we, how do we take ourselves off of the story that we live inside of the difference of these, and find our way into accepting both even.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, my answer to the question would be, well, China has a different view, right? And I think as a country of 1.4 billion people, growing the way that it is, and under its particular kind of governance system, it behooves us to have at least at our foundations a basic respect for self-determination, because the United States is founded upon slavery, colonialism, genocide. That's what US democracy really is. I mean, we talk about it all the time, right? Democracy, democracy, democracy. But what democracy really looks like in the United States is settler colonialism, is racism, is endless war. There hasn't been a vote cast in the United States prior to that, right? So that's the foundations that we're living in. China has a completely different history from the United States, and actually a completely different relationship. US gunboats used to sail up and down Shanghai, the coast of Shanghai, and occupy the country. And that's a reality that China looks at. And so this relationship, even though I think a lot of people have seen and misinterpreted the normalization process that the US and China went through in the 70s as somehow being in collaboration with each other around spreading evil around the world. The real fact of the matter is that the US has been an imperial power for such a long time, and China has always been playing a defensive role in protecting itself against that, and finding a way out of that kind of relationship, that imperial relationship the United States possesses with the world. And it's hard for people to look at it like this now, because China does have a growing economy. It will surpass the United States economically, but it won't surpass it militarily. It has no interest in surpassing it militarily. It is not growing in the way that the United States has grown. And, if people want to believe that it is, they can go anywhere else in the world and no one will agree with them. So that's the thing. That's part of this hubris, is this idea that somehow we have a monopoly on what democracy is. We have a monopoly on what is the right path to development. And I think that's something we as peace activists need to get out of, because if we don't, we run the risk of reinforcing the very ideas which allow this endless war drive from the United States to go on and on and on towards China and towards anyone else.
So in my time in China, what I noticed was actually, like at CODEPINK, we try to like grow a local peace economy to get people more engaged citizens. And you do that locally by being responsible for your community. And, what I saw in China was that is what it's born, that's its core. Like in a weird way, I found it more democratic than the US, in the sense of what I feel democracy is, and citizen engagement in creating what their world is and how they're affected by it. So I was kind of shocked to find out that, you know, every community is run by a community governance structure that, you know, makes up the decisions. And it was really interesting because we live in Shanghai and Sanya. So in the Shanghai neighborhood, how the quarantine worked was totally different than in Sanya, because the neighborhood decided it. And the young people in Shanghai, they did it totally different than the older people in Sanya. We live in a neighborhood with like older people. So it was created according to the context of who lives there. And it was funny, in Shanghai, it was way stricter in Sanya than Shanghai. And so, you know, you got to see like all those decisions were made locally. And then you get to watch the fights. You know, I watch when I'm there, the fights that are going on about the planet. I mean, I think people in America don't understand that 99% of the people that live in China believe in climate change. Not only they believe in climate change, but they work really hard to change their local governments as fast as they can. Like the iteration around climate change is crazy. I mean, you get like a $500, you know, you have 7 trash cans and you are responsible for sorting your own trash. It doesn't happen at the trash place. And so you get a fine of $500 if you don't do it right. I know my most anxiety happens when I throw the trash away. Like, what am I doing? And then, you know, like, so, and not only that, but those are simple things. But, you know, in poor neighborhoods, there's not toxic waste dumps because the local people, like, they fight for their air, they fight for their, you know, and the decisions that have been made around transportation itself, the long-term decisions about having it be trains that are take up a lot less resources than airplanes. And that I think the last holiday, I forgot, National Day or whatever it is, that last week where they take a holiday, 900 million people moved, but most of those people move on trains. So, you know, that they've really built, and that's cheaper for the traveler. It's cheaper for, you know, it's less costly, less much of a footprint in travel. So you watch them, you know, they come up with the idea. Now globally, they are the leader in air and wind energy and solar energy and technologies. So that I think answers a couple of the questions that came up, like what are they doing about climate change?
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
have some experience. I mean, you're bringing me back really. Around this time last year, I was getting ready for the delegation. You had Suhin Lee on, and I went to China with him for 2.5 weeks, and we learned. I mean, you've been there. You see the commitment to renewable energy in real time. Like China is a global leader in producing renewable energy and leads in domestic use as well. So you see it everywhere. And you know, we learned about the different laws, as you said, local governments and people and local people are working these problems out for themselves. And everywhere there's some law that, you know, bans or curbs diesel fuel purchases of cars. So like in Beijing, you can't purchase a new diesel fueled car anymore. But in Shanghai, you can if you want. You just have to pay double the price of a single car because you have to get a special permit. So there are these laws that disincentivize these real catastrophic climate, you know, destroying commodities, which is really embedded in the overall country's trajectory in trying to become a carbon neutral country and doing everything it can to be a world leader in this movement to defeat climate change. And the campaign, China is not our enemy, I feel like our goal hopefully is to get to the point where we can say China is not our enemy and we can learn from each other. We can learn from China. We can learn from what China is doing, because there is so much that I think we can learn. And that's what I was able to learn going there. And then ever since, just being able to meet people who are also in this work, you know, trying to build a world that's peaceful and a world that's better than the one we have right now.
So we, Cheryl once, you know, brought up again this, the surveillance and the restrictive life of people in China. If there's anything you want to say about that.
Sure. I mean, you know, is a security system in China. It is certainly one that is, present and visible when you go. However, I think it's important to understand context is always important. And we know in the United States, we only have, if we've grown up in the United States and that's all we've known, if we've grown up in the West and that's all we've known, we know what surveillance is all about and what policing is all about. We know that it's about protecting, the property, the rights of the rich people, of powerful people, and to suppress those of people who are not powerful, who are powerless. In China, it's a bit different because China, in a very short period of time, has been, I think, independent only for a little over 70 years, has had actual security threats. The US bombed one of their embassies in Belgrade. There has been wars raging all over China's borders. There has been, US incursions in Korea and Vietnam that we know of. China has been threatened with nuclear weapons on several occasions in the last 70 years. So with that said, it would be remiss to think that China itself wouldn't have a security system to protect itself, wouldn't have a military, wouldn't have a police. And so that is definitely present. And, not many people know that there are real threats to China's internal security, both internally and externally, and they're not necessarily disconnected. That goes with this whole cyber warfare, tech warfare thing. Everyone wants to talk about the Great Firewall, but don't want to talk about the CIA. WikiLeaks found that the CIA had been hacking into Chinese, companies, economic institutions for 11 years, taking personal data, taking, all sorts of information. And so there is this larger kind of world we have to look at when we talk about these kind of issues. And it's important to understand that there are times where, a security system can protect the needs and the interests of people. And it's not always perfect and it's not always good, but it does happen and it does exist around the world. There are examples of that. But
And I think Ed Snowden
important.
showed us that the US definitely has its own surveillance system. So
Oh yeah. I mean, it's this global context.
yeah.
Exactly.
But I also think, one of the things is that how do we be against US aggression on China without having to accept Chinese government? I think that's one of the Chinese finger torture things we get caught in the sense of to just like, with Iran or, any of the countries that we don't want to go to war with, the argument gets like their government is bad. So it's not to get on the argument of their government is good. It's that whatever their government is their self-determination and up to the people who live in that country. And that what we're trying to do as Americans is stop our government's aggression on China. It doesn't mean there's an agreement with their government. It means that we have a government we're responsible for, and what we are trying to do is say, no, there is no reason to be aggressing at China. We need to be cooperating with China. And that when we get caught in these stories about the government and around some of these other things, that then that's a distraction. It gets us sucked in instead of standing on the platform of no racism, no war, and we want a world where it's about caring and life. And those three things, if we stay in the conversation about those three things, that's what we're here about. Hate and lies cause racism. Hate and lies take us to wars of aggression that take away the money we need for people. They create quagmires that involve all the countries in the world, because it's like that means you're going to pull in NATO and you're going to pull in Australia, and then everybody is in the fight. And so another reason to stop it. And that right now we need to be investing that money in caring, in learning how to live on a planet together and not drive us to war. So it's not about the Chinese government. It's not, once we get to having cooperation, we're going to have more influence on them than as an antagonizer, because as we know, in antagonizing, which is what you just described, if there is an external enemy, it creates less internal capacity for human rights, because you have to protect yourself. And we see that in Iran, we see that everywhere. It's like and then that gets used. You attack the country, they have to protect themselves, and then you use their protections against them for reason to attack them. It's one of the tricks. So we just can't let that trick use us. We have to remember, it's like, we're here to stop war. We're here to stop the US aggression on China, and we're here to stop the money that will again go to the weapons industry, make them richer and create even more havoc on the planet. And we've gone way over time, Danny. I'm so grateful for this conversation with you. And what it's done is, even in the chat, reminded us of, like, it's a complex subject, and it's good to get inside of it and learn more. There's the Dongfeng Collective that comes out every week, dongfengcollective.org, and Angela will post that. We just need to be smarter as Americans, because it will help us have the capacity to hold both, to hold all of it. And that's, I think, our job as peace activists, to be able to hold all of it, to not be used to be that we're against anything, because it's not our determination as Americans how people should live. And how are they choosing? And then, we can gather as human rights activists and work on those issues. And we can gather as, self-determination activists and see what we learn. But it's like, in being a peace activist, we learn what peace is. And we know that it's not lies and hate. We know that it's not divisions and othering. We know that it is accepting and understanding and being in conversation. So thank you for this conversation, Danny. Thank you for all those that attended and asked your questions and engaged. So grateful. Please be in a room, and when you hear lies and hate, when you hear separation, be love and peace. That's the one thing we can always do. We need more of that. Thank you.